Emma Lubitsch, and you're watching CAN TV. We're here today with Ralph Martire, professor at Roosevelt University and executive director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me on the program, Emma. What do you got?
So first, just give us a background about the work that CTBA does generally.
All right, so we're an odd organization because we're not technically nonpartisan, we're bipartisan. So our board of directors has Democrats and Republicans on it that don't even like or trust each other at all. And that's a great thing for us at the staff because we don't really care much about ideology. We care about best practices and data-driven approaches to solving problems. And so basically, if the public sector raises money to spend on a service, we get involved, whether it's on the raising the revenue side or it's on the expenditure side. And what we look at are best practices and try to find ways to ensure the public sector has adequate capacity to fund best practices along core service areas.
And so CTBA has done multiple studies of income inequality in Illinois, and you've made some pretty jarring discoveries. So talk to us about what you found.
Yeah, I mean, if you just want to look at Illinois specific data, I mean, it's kind of eye-opening from and where we got our data from. So we got it from the Internal Revenue Service. So based on what Illinoisans reported to the feds as their income. From 1979 to 2017, the wealthiest 1% in our state, after inflation in real terms, saw their average incomes increase from about $411,000 a year to over 1.4 million. That's an increase of 254% from 1979 to 2017. For the wealthiest 1%. For the bottom 99%, meaning everybody else, the average income went up from $51,000 to $61,000 a year, a 20% jump. So you see this dramatic skew in growing income inequality over time in our state. And actually the bottom 90% in Illinois saw their incomes decline on an inflation adjusted basis. So really all the growth in income in Illinois in the last 40 years has gone to the wealthiest 10%, but really the wealthiest 2 or 3%.
And so one potential remedy for the income inequality that's been identified is the implementation of a progressive income tax or a fair tax. So Illinoisans will be able to vote on November 3rd to ratify the Illinois Constitution, which currently mandates a flat rate income tax for all residents. So talk to us about this. I mean, why is a flat rate income tax so harmful to low and moderate income earners?
Yeah, well, first let's talk about what they do and don't get to ratify. So in November, the ratification process is a change to the Illinois Constitution that simply makes a graduated rate structure permissive. Currently, as you said, Emma, the state's required to have one flat rate for its income tax apply to all levels of income. Now, if the amendment's ratified, by the way, the state can keep a flat rate structure. It just makes a graduated rate structure permissive. And then we know what the new graduated rate structure is going to be because enabling legislation passed last legislative session on a bipartisan basis and was signed into law by Governor Pritzker. So if the amendment gets ratified, then on January 1st of 2021, we know what the new rate structure is going to be. It's a graduated rate structure that cuts taxes for the bottom 97% of taxpayers and increases it only on the wealthiest 3%. So that's sort of the big picture of what's going on. Now, why moving to a graduated rate structure makes so much sense from both a tax policy and an economic standpoint. So if you were to take my master's class at Roosevelt University on public budgeting and fiscal policy, and Emma, I'm kind of surprised you haven't enrolled in that class yet, a little disappointed, but okay, fine. But if you were to take that class, you would know that the income tax has two jobs as a tax. Different taxes fulfill different functions for your fiscal system. One of the key functions of the income tax is to offset the natural regressivity of every other tax and fee charged by state and local government. So sales taxes, excise taxes, property taxes, fees like driver's license fees, all those things, they're highly regressive. They take a much bigger portion of the pay of a low-income worker than they do of an affluent worker. The only tax that could offset that's generally available at the state and local levels, the income tax. And then only if it has a graduated rate structure, right? So if it has a flat rate, it does nothing to offset the natural regressivity of all these other taxes, meaning your tax system will be regressive, which means it will impose a much greater tax burden on low and middle income families as a percentage of their income than on affluent families as a percentage of their income. Now, given what's happened with income inequality growth in Illinois, I mean, that makes no sense from an equity standpoint or a fairness standpoint, whatever word you want to use. But really, it makes no sense from a fiscal standpoint. Why? You want your taxes to respond to the modern economy. So the income tax can only do that if it has a graduated rate structure when you have significantly growing income inequality. And the way it responds to that is it focuses higher tax rates on higher levels of income and lower tax rates on lower levels of income. That literally responds to how economic growth is being distributed in the modern economy. Once again, the constitutional requisite that we could only have one flat rate gets in the way of the income tax literally performing both of the core functions it is supposed to perform for your tax system. So not surprisingly, that doesn't work. And in Illinois, we have one of the most unfair regressive taxing systems in all of America, and one of the most underperforming taxing systems in America, that our revenue growth over time literally doesn't keep up with economic growth. And primary reason for that is our income tax doesn't respond to how income distribution happens in the modern economy over time.
And so how many other states have progressive income tax structures?
Okay, so 41 states have an income tax, and of those 41, 32 have a graduated rate structure. That's 76%. So the vast majority of states with an income tax have a graduated rate structure, as does the federal government. And it's enjoyed broad bipartisan support. I mean, even Ronald Reagan was for progressive taxation, and the way he tried to accomplish it primarily was providing targeted tax relief through the earned income tax credit to low and middle income families, reducing their federal income tax burden, leaving the federal tax burden in place for more affluent folks. George W. Bush bragged when he put his tax proposals in front of Congress way back in 2001 that it would shift tax burden away from the bottom and middle and move it to the top. So it shouldn't be a partisan issue. It really should be, let's design tax policy to work in a modern economy. Let's design tax policy to treat taxpayers fairly, given how incomes are actually distributed. You wouldn't know that from the money being spent against the fair tax and the crazy attacks being made on it.
So break down the way that the fair tax works. So talk about the different income brackets. So like, who will see significant tax increases?
So the way it works, our current flat rate is 4.95%. And under the new structure passed that will be implemented if the amendment is ratified, that rate is lowered on all income below $100,000, whether you're single or married filing jointly. So if your taxable income is less, well, let's start at the bottom and move up. If your taxable income is between 0 or 10,000, or for your taxable income between 0 and 10,000, you will pay a lower rate of 4.75% on that portion of your taxable income. So on your next $90,000 of taxable income, i.e. the portion between 10,000 and 100,000, you still pay a lower rate than the current rate, 4.9%. Now, as it turns out in Illinois, 86% of all tax filers have total taxable income below $100,000. So 86% of taxpayers right there will pay a lower tax burden than under current law. Now, the new rate does impose the current flat rate of 4.95% on taxable incomes between $100,000 and $250,000. But remember, even if you have taxable income, let's say $248,000, your first $10,000 was taxed at the lower rate of 4.75%. Your next $90,000 was taxed at the lower rate of 4.9%. And it's only your taxable income between $100,000 and $250,000 that's taxed at the current flat rate of 4.95%. So the way this works out when you look at all tax filers in Illinois is 97% will end up paying less than they do under the current flat system. And only the wealthiest 3% will end up paying more. Now, I will have to point out, there's one slight oddity in our graduated rate structure. So if you're single and you have taxable income of $750,000 a year or more, you go from paying a flat rate of 4.95% under current law to a flat rate of 7.99%. You don't get advantage of any of these graduated rate structures. If you're married filing jointly and you have $1 million or more of taxable income, same thing. You go from paying a flat rate of 4.95% to a flat rate of 7.99%. Now, in case and you might fall in that category, I know how well they pay on CAN TV, so I think you're probably one of the people that's concerned about this, Emma, but it only really impacts 0.3% of all the tax filers in Illinois. 0.3% have taxable incomes at that level.
So one thing that critics of the tax have repeatedly brought up is out-migration from Illinois. So essentially that people are, quote unquote, fleeing the state. So they argue that the implementation of the fair tax would help to further this trend. So you've done some research around this. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so lies, darn lies, and the things said by the anti-tax crowd are the three worst kind of lies you could have. And I'm just saying what's interesting here is there's never been a peer-reviewed study that finds any statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and your migration. These items are not statistically related. If you want to know what has a statistically meaningful relationship to driving migration, there's only a couple of things. I'll go through them. Number one, you get a job in a different state, you tend to move to that different state to take the job. Crazy, I know, but there's a statistically meaningful relationship there. Family concern. So the kids grow up and live in a different state for whatever reason and have children, the grandparents want to live near the grandkids. Or vice versa, the kids want to move to where the grandparents are so their kids get to see their grandparents. So family reasons. Three, this is going to be particularly hard for people to believe who live in the Chicago metropolitan area, but apparently some people like nice weather. So there's a statistically meaningful correlation between weather and migration, in particular, nice weather. And then the final thing are housing prices. So if you're in a region and the housing prices in one state are significantly lower than they're in another state, so you could move to a bordering state and still keep your job and everything else, you will do that to get a bigger house for less money, right? That's it. Nothing else is a statistically meaningful relationship. You look at Illinois, we've had net out-migration every year since 1920. We are just a good state to leave for a number of different reasons. But that said, it certainly isn't related to tax policy. In fact, out-migration slowed down in Illinois when the temporary tax increase that passed in 2010 began to phase out, so the rates went lower in 2016 and 17. Out-migration increased when the rates went lower, and it decreased when the rates were higher. I mean, so these people that are trying to make an argument that there's some correlation, apparently folks can't wait to be taxed more. They stayed around when the taxes were higher. I mean, they're just not related. It's a silly thing to say. And interestingly, even though a greater number of people in absolute value move from, let's say, Illinois every year into our neighboring state of Indiana or our neighboring state of Wisconsin, and the number of people from those two states that move into our state, a greater percentage of the populations of Wisconsin and Indiana move into Illinois every year than the percentage of our population that moves into their states. It's a big state with a lot of people. And where these folks from Indiana and Wisconsin are moving is Cook and the Collier counties, where we have the highest combined tax burdens. It's just one of these arguments folks like to say, because there's some data that back it out, we have net out migration. It's just simply not related to tax purposes. And you even want to look at a couple of states that pass special millionaires or high income taxes. You have Midwestern state Minnesota, which bumped up its top income tax rate from 7.85% to 9.85% back in 2013, I believe it was. California made a jump in its top income tax rate from 10.85% to 13%, same time period. And every year thereafter, they had net growth in millionaires. So come on, who are we kidding? The people actually leaving Illinois, by the way, are low to middle income families. The data there is compelling. I mean, what we see is, and I'm trying to pull up the number here on my computer screen, it's incomes, taxable incomes below $25,000 a year. That's who's leaving Illinois. And they're leaving Illinois because they don't have jobs.
So another argument that's made in opposition to the fair tax is that it gives state lawmakers more latitude, whereas before they were constrained by the Constitution. So essentially arguing that once the Constitution is ratified, lawmakers will have more flexibility to raise taxes on everybody in the future. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a bald-faced lie. So this doesn't create any new authority to tax that doesn't exist today. What it does is it creates the ability, when imposing the income tax, to do it at a graduated rate rather than a flat rate. So under current law, if the state wanted to increase the income tax, it would have to do that for everybody, whether you work at McDonald's or you're Ken Griffin, and let's say you have slightly more income than a McDonald's worker. And that's, like I said, not the tax policy doesn't respond to the economy. This only creates the ability to say, you know what, we do need new tax revenue. We don't want to hit low and middle income families, so let's just tax the wealthy with this change. That's it. But it doesn't create any new authority whatsoever to tax. It doesn't create an authority to tax income in different, it just doesn't. That's a lie. I know one of the things they like to throw out there is that it makes it more likely we're going to tax retirement income some way, right? First of all, have you ever heard of an organization called the AARP? Have you heard of them?
Yep.
For those with people my hair color, you join ARP because you get all these great discounts. But anyway, ARP is 100% behind the Fair Tax Initiative, 100% behind. They were also 100% against ever taxing any retirement income ever. There's nothing in the amendment to the Constitution nor in the rate structure created by the fair tax that would tax retirement income more or create any legal authority to tax retirement income more. The only reason we don't tax retirement income today in Illinois, the only reason, is the state passed a law that says, you know what, we're going to allow a full deduction of retirement income from the income tax base. So when you file your income tax return and you start earning some retirement income, whatever that is, you get to deduct that from your adjusted gross income when you're determining your taxable income. It's a deduction created by law. They could change that law any given time. So myth, and myth, certainly nothing based in fact. All the other side has, the anti-fair tax side has, are unsubstantiated fear tactics. And what they're trying to do is play on people's worst fears and general distrust of government and specific mistrust of Illinois government. And why should people mistrust Illinois government? We've had 5 governors go to jail. We've had everybody invest. Right? So they play on these fears and actually get people to vote against their own economic interest and the interest of their communities.
Right. And so let's talk about the role that COVID-19 now plays in the lives of individuals in the state and also in the state budget. So would the fair tax provide some relief for individuals who are, hit the hardest by the impacts of COVID? And then does it also provide extra revenue for the state?
So the answer is yes and yes. And so, like I said, it does provide tax relief for the bottom 97% of income earners in Illinois. And let's just talk about what COVID's done to the economy, and obviously nothing good. But if you look at where the job loss has been concentrated, it hasn't been rich folks. So 30% of the jobs in the bottom 2 wage quintiles, the lowest paying wage quintiles, have been lost during COVID. Only 5% of the jobs in the top wage quintile. So COVID-19 pandemic has particularly been difficult for low to low middle income working families. So that's who's losing their jobs. And that's really bad on the economy because it will result in reduced consumer spending. And no one wants reduced consumer spending because generally speaking, 68 to 70% of all economic activity at the state level or the federal level is consumer spending. And the reason this job loss creates reduced consumer spending has to go with that income inequality we talked about earlier, Emma, right? So low and middle income families on an inflation adjusted basis have not seen their incomes grow at all for 40 years. They've actually seen it decline. So they take their income and they spend all of it. They don't save because they don't have the luxury of saving. That's what they do. When they lose their jobs, they spend less. Now, the tax relief provided by this will help some folks at least increase their consumer spending a little bit, those in the bottom 97%, through the tax relief provided by the legislation. Now, the tax relief isn't huge, a few $100 million, but still that's a few $100 million that's going to be spent in local economies across Illinois supporting and creating jobs. The tax increase is focused on only the wealthiest 3%. Now they, unlike their peers at the bottom and middle, don't tend to spend every additional dollar they get or stop spending when you tax them more. Why? The growth in income inequality. Their incomes have been increasing so substantially on an inflation-adjusted basis over time that any adjustment to their income up or down doesn't really modify their consumption patterns because they have so much money. So a tax increase like the one designed by the fair tax is actually really good economic policy during an economic downturn like the one we're experiencing, because number one, it'll promote some additional consumer spending by low and moderate income families in that 97% that gets a tax cut. Number two, it won't reduce consumer spending because it focuses its tax increase on those whose incomes are growing so expansively that they're not going to change their consumption patterns. But number three, and this gets missed a lot, the way that money gets spent by state government, so it's going to raise, in a non-COVID economy, it would raise $3.6 billion in new revenue. In a COVID economy, it's going to raise less, right? Because even though top income classes haven't been hit nearly as hard as the bottom and middle by the pandemic, they've 5% of the jobs at the top have still disappeared. So it's not going to raise the same amount as it would have, but let's say it raises 2.5, 2.6 billion. Well, that new revenue gets spent on whatever the state spends its money on. And if you look at state expenditures, and I'm sure you have, this is one of the things you stay up every night looking at, is where the state spends its money. I can just tell by looking at it. So is four things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. So when the state is spending its money on those four things, what it's really spending on is the salaries of the teachers and the social workers and the healthcare providers and the correctional officers, who happen to be middle income workers, who happen to spend all their money in the economy. So you're raising this money from folks who aren't going to spend less, and you're supporting jobs of people who are going to spend their entire paycheck. So you get another positive multiplier in your economy. And this isn't just me talking here. This is Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who actually looked at what states did coming out of the Great Recession. And he found that those states that raised taxes on the wealthy and maintained or enhanced spending on services recovered much quicker than the states that cut spending on services for precisely the reasons I just talked about.
Right. And so some closing thoughts on the fair tax. I mean, what information do voters absolutely need to know before they head to the polls on November 3rd?
This is a really good tax proposal, and it raises revenue the right way. It allows our income tax system to respond to the modern economy. It allows our income tax system to respond to how income is actually distributed in the modern economy over time. It permits the income tax to play its key role of not just responding to the economy, but also offsetting the natural regressivity of every other tax or fee charged by state and local government. And it doesn't make us tax it or create an undue burden for the wealthy or anything like that. I mean, I know there's a lot of malarkey out there about this, but the truth of the matter is, we have one of the most regressive taxing systems in America. We're currently the bottom 20% in earners are paying over 14% of their income in state and local taxes, while the wealthiest 1% pay just over 7%. After this law becomes effective, tax burden at the bottom goes down, and it goes up at the top from 7%, 7.4% to 9.8%, which is still the lowest tax burden in the state. So it's not some crazy eat the rich strategy or whatever. It just flattens the curve of regressivity a little bit by using the income tax for its intended purpose. It doesn't tax retirement income. It doesn't create any right to tax retirement income. It is one of the 2 or 3 things the state of Illinois absolutely has to do to get its fiscal house in order. It doesn't solve all the state's problems, but it is a crucial step toward solving those problems.